Hi, I'm Christopher Wolfe. I'm president of the American Public Philosophy Institute, and I'm fortunate to be able to interview today Michael Greve of George Mason Law School, formerly of the American Enterprise Institute, founder of the Center for Individual Rights. So welcome, Mike. It's great to have you here at the University of Dallas. So where do you come from? What's your background?
Oh, good grief. Where do I come from?
Yeah.
As probably most people can already tell, I was born and raised here. I came to the United States in 1981 on a Fulbright scholarship.
Oh.
So
To study what or do what?
political science. Well, originally philosophy, and that didn't interest me very much after all. I mean, American style analytic philosophy. So switched to the government department and got my PhD there.
And where was that?
Cornell.
At Cornell. So do you have some favorite teachers there? Yeah.
Well, my favorite teacher at the time, Jeremy Rapkin, is now my colleague at George Mason. So,
Sure.
yeah.
That's great. And where did you come from?
Hamburg, Germany, which is sort of way up north, very sort of Anglophile, and now very prosperous city.
And had you
Love it
intended
dearly.
to stay in the United States when you came, or was
No, not really. I mean, that was, well, after 10 minutes, I decided, I didn't really want to leave. But it was not the original intent, so to speak.
Yes, indeed. So you went to Cornell, and then what kind of influences on you at Cornell were important, or were there?
Well, the one thing that is striking for everyone who, or for, at any rate for me, it was how hard American students work.
Really?
Much harder than at German universities, at least.
Isn't that great to hear, Americans? That we do have something going for us there, huh?
I think basically after high school, German students are still pretty well prepared. Those schools are pretty good, but American students easily make that up in 4 years of college,
That's
at least
very
at those kinds of institutions. So that was one striking thing. And then the other striking thing for me was the sort of earnestness with which Americans engage their constitutional tradition, which is very endearing, which is a great strength of this country, which you just don't see in other countries at all.
Well, other
And so
constitutions aren't as old.
They're not as old. That's true. They're also not as sort of well thought out and worthy of admiration. So
That's one line of study that you were attracted to, then.
Yeah.
The constitutional tradition.
I mean, somehow these guys back then managed to sort of constitutionalize our politics, right? And that's a stroke of genius.
Well, as somebody
It's
who
not
teaches
easy to
constitutional law, I have a deep appreciation for that. So from Cornell, what did you decide to do after that?
Well, I sort of looked around. I thought about teaching, taught part-time at some institutions, but I went to work for a grant-making foundation in Manhattan, Smith Richardson Foundation.
Yeah.
Worked there. That was enormously rewarding.
And you get to see a lot of interesting intellectual projects.
You get to see a lot of interesting projects, a lot of famous people. So it's right. You come with money. The doors are open everywhere, and it was really quite rewarding that way.
And then what led you to go from there to somewhere else?
Well, I mean, just speaking for myself, I mean, lots of people sort of think it's great to be a foundation officer and to make that a career, and it's very worthwhile career. I found that after a while, sort of most of the thrills are vicarious. You catch yourself saying things like, "Yeah, we did this." No, you didn't. You just gave them the money. And so that's why I sort of struck out and with a friend then started the Center for Individual Rights, which is a public interest law firm.
Maybe you had something of what I had at Notre Dame. I was thinking originally of being a lawyer, and then I don't know, probably halfway through Notre Dame, I figured, okay, if I have a choice between getting paid a whole lot of money for saying what other people want me to say, or get paid not so much money to say what I want to say, how would you weigh those two against each other? And I said, gee, I'd much rather say what I want to say. So I became a college professor eventually. I guess you wanted to say what you wanted to say too, huh?
Over time, yeah.
So what was the goal of the Center for Individual Rights?
The idea was to, well, as the name indicates, right, take individual rights a bit more seriously. So we did a lot of work on speech codes, college speech codes. I mean, this is kind of eerie, this was in the 1990s. And I thought, and those cases were very easy to win, right? Because once you sort of expose these administrations to courts and the First Amendment, they don't look so good. And I really thought, that'll never come back. Now we have them beat. And whoops, 20 years later, they're back.
It's very strange, because you think of the university as this kind of bastion of intellectual freedom, academic freedom, and then you find that it's not always very supportive of that intellectual freedom. Although I must say, back then, at least you didn't hear things about trigger words and microaggressions. Yeah, aside from the academic area, were there other areas that you worked in as well at the center?
Well, I wrote some books and articles. I taught as an adjunct at Boston College and at Cornell. 1 year, I think, at the Cornell and Washington program. I wrote a fairly big and ambitious book about American federalism while I was there that arose actually out of cases that we litigated, including there were these. In 1995, the Supreme Court rediscovered that, there are limits to Congress's power under the Commerce Clause. So that was the first case, called Lopez. The next case was called United States versus Morrison, and Mr. Morrison was our client then. So,
not a particularly noble client, perhaps. But
let's put it this way: not a choir boy, but also not guilty of these accusations that were levied against him.
Fair enough. I was actually giving a quiz this morning in constitutional law on that included Morrison. And it's that resurrection of the Commerce Clause is really interesting, because I started studying constitutional law back in around 1971, 72, and it was simply taken for granted at that time that the Commerce Clause was dead, that any Commerce Clause limitations had simply died in 1937, and that there might be political objections perhaps to some Commerce Clause based legislation, but that jurisprudential ones that was just gone. And so, as you say, Lopez was quite a dramatic rejuvenation of the Commerce Clause limits.
Yeah. I don't know how far it carries, but at least now they have the right test, right? That's actually, the law is a little bit better than it was 2 decades ago.
Yeah. It's striking, though, that if you really, for instance, the cases, Lopez and Morrison, where you had something struck down, I don't think it'd be very difficult to figure out a way to rewrite legislation to get exactly what that was supposed to do. That would be pretty successful. It would not be likely to be struck down.
And they did it, actually. The Gun-Free School Zones Act was reenacted, and in a slightly different version. Same ideas, same objectives, same everything. And that was repeatedly sustained. So, there are ways for Congress to legislate around whatever the Supreme Court imposes by way of restriction. But look, there's a cost to it, right? Because otherwise they would have done it that way in the first place.
This was a shot across the bow. You got to think about these questions. Although I think there's a serious question whether or not it can fairly be said now, as it was earlier in American history, that the federal government is a government of enumerated powers. Because it seems to me nowadays that it's pretty close to a government of general powers, that it has some way to accomplish almost anything that it wants to do. So that's a pretty substantial change.
That's a big change, yes.
So, and you've done a bunch of other books along the way as well. Can you tell us about some of those?
Oh, some of those. Well, the biggest, most recent one is called The Upside Down Constitution, and it's about the sort of constitutional changes and about how to think about the Constitution and, I mean, the structural Constitution, very little about the Bill of Rights.
How should we think about the Constitution?
Oh, we might be here by midnight.
Yes. Give us the elevator speech on it, okay?
One of the themes, I mean, the central theme around which it's organized is American federalism. And the argument there is that what you really want from federalism is competition among states as a way of disciplining government. Because we have precious few ways of doing that now. And so that's the overarching theme. And I describe how that worked in the 19th century and how the progressives and New Dealers didn't like it and dealt with it and called it a race to the bottom. Right? So that competition itself is the harm. And I think, I mean, at the end of the day, that's actually one of the few things in American politics to be optimistic about.
Because you think we do have that, in a way, a rejuvenation of federalism as this kind of competition. Yeah. Of course, living in Texas, that kind of represents one particular approach to things that quite different from California or New York.
Yes. No, that's sort of I mean, what you allude to is sort of the revival of sectionalism in American politics, right? It's almost always the same blocks of states opposed to one another on healthcare and health insurance and clean power and all the rest of it. And if you don't have that, if it's too easy to sort of bribe states into winning coalitions, you're not going to have any competition among states. You only have it if there are things at stake that are for states really existential. And so, no, they're not going to play.
Yeah,
you cannot pay Texas to enact President Obama's agenda.
Right.
It is not going to happen.
Yeah, that's very different. Again, years ago, the assumption was that the federal government offers the states a lot of money and says, here, if you want to do what we want you to do, there's all this money, or you can say no and lose it all. The assumption was that politically it was impossible to actually say no to the federal offer. And yet now, a huge number of states rejected the Obamacare exchanges and
the Medicaid expansion. That's
yes.
even more amazing, right? Yeah. Because that's real money.
Yeah. Scott Walker, I thought was, as you know, I lived in Wisconsin for many years, and I thought it was quite interesting that Walker not only rejected the federal plan, but really offered a conservative alternative in Badger Care, where there was an attempt to offer a good state program that would try to deal with the same kinds of problems or issues. It wasn't just a conservative no, but rather, hey, listen, let's look at this alternative that we can do through states. And
did it work?
I think it's worked in Wisconsin. That's my view. I can't claim to be an expert on it, but it didn't work well enough for Walker to still be in the presidential race, I guess. But I think he's actually an interesting example of the kind of revival of federalism, because he and other, especially conservative governors, I think, have had a real impact on American politics in the last 10, 15 years. Or people like Mitch Daniels, John Kasich, right. And others have really had an impact on American politics by what they've done at the state level.
And I think a large part of it is, this is not sort of rah-rah conservatism or Tea Party stuff, right? I am sort of amazed at how much incompetence, sheer incompetence American voters now put up with when it comes to the federal government, right? And what is remarkable about sort of examples like that, Mitch Daniels, Scott Walker, Jeb Bush, quite probably, is it's actually competently run government, and how's that for a change? So
So there's a real impact.
So there's, I mean, that's one of the, advantages of a big and federal country. Not everything goes to pot at the same time.
I guess one thing I do worry about in terms of the long-term prospect for this is that the fact that the blue states, the West Coast and the East Coast in particular, there's a fairly even balance in some ways in terms of population between the red staters and the blue staters. But in terms of impact on the social media and the organs of public opinion in American society, there's just a huge built-in advantage, I think, in the New York, Washington, Los Angeles axis, and that makes it, more difficult perhaps for conservatives to resist the tendency to centralize that tends to be more dominant in the coasts.
That's probably right. On the other hand, I think it's become just so hard to impose anybody's views, right? It's just simply too atomized. It's just not true that you can own 3 networks, right? And that's where your news comes from, and that's sort of the tone to which the country adjusts.
What about Obergefell? Is that an example of a view being imposed on the country? That's the same-sex marriage decision, of course.
Well, let me put it this way. I mean, put the case aside, right? Which I have my own views on. It's sort of a very dramatic. I mean, it's as rapid a change in sort of social perceptions on very fundamental matters as anybody can recall, I think. And I think that's in large measure not imposed by diktat or anything like that. It's these things snowball.
Yeah, but how did they snowball? Didn't they snowball especially through the luck that certain, on social issues, that liberal thought tends to have in New York and especially in Hollywood. And with the result being that younger people have virtually not heard the other side that has actually been dominant in most states in the country for many years.
That's true.
So it seems to be social issues are very different from economic ones in this respect. In some ways, there's a greater balance economically in the country than I think there is on social issues, where the influence of liberal media elites, I think, is very distinctive and very powerful. And it's also because, in some respects, on those issues, I think there's a tacit alliance between the liberal intellectual elites and big business elites as well. But there's a fairly big gap, I think, between those elite views and ordinary people views, except that, of course, over time, especially with young people, the ordinary young people are drifting more and more to what is virtually the only perspective that's being presented to them.
On that issue, that's probably right. Yeah. But I wonder how true it is of other things, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a dominant liberal position on abortion, and they haven't been able to put it over.
Not quite. Yeah, that's really, I think, it's
that
an extraordinary.
Played out very differently, right? Yeah. So it may depend on what the issue is.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's very hard to resist is simply niceness. That is what young people believe in. Let's be nice. And
that's true. So do you have any projects on the future projects you're thinking of now, or things you'd like to work on?
I'm thoroughly enjoying GMU Law School. Uh-huh. It's really a great climate. I love my colleagues. I love the law school. Sort of very diverse views and people who work in very different fields and intellectual traditions. So that's a thrill, and the students are fun.
Teaching is a wonderful thing.
It's a great profession.
So sometimes I hear colleagues, not here, but there's a common kind of grousing among college professors that they're not paid as much as they should be, because they look at their other well-educated friends who are lawyers or doctors who are getting paid more perhaps. But one thing college professors sometimes understate is the enormous non-monetary compensation we get, just the delight in teaching, the intellectual life, the engaging with the students.
Yeah.
So.
And, I mean, in terms of academic work, the obsession du jour, this will actually stay with us, is the executive state, right? Which is
It's huge.
and that is a big theme in our inability to figure out a legal system that constrains the executive and keeps it within bounds.
That sounds like a great topic for a book, Mike.
One of these days. I'm working on it, Chris.
Good. We'll look forward to it. Great. Well, again, this is Chris Wolfe of the American Public Philosophy Institute. We've been talking here with Michael Greve of George Mason Law School. It's great to have the opportunity to have him here, and we'll look forward to seeing you at another interesting interview one of these days. Take care.